the Death, Taxes and Change podcast, the podcast where the certain things in life are not as certain as you may think. In today's episode, we'll talk about the books about death, taxes and change. But first, a brief introduction. Daniël, who are you when you are at home?
Yeah, Paul. I think we haven't, in the 4 episodes we've done so far in the Death, Taxes and Change podcast, we haven't really ever chatted and just tell you as listener who we are. Firstly, hi, my name is Daniël Eloff. I'm an attorney specializing in civil rights and public interest litigation. I reside in Pretoria. I'm a born and bred Pretorian, if that's even a word. I've grown up under the shade of the beautiful purple jacaranda trees. And here I am doing podcasts for fun and absolutely no money.
Yay. So my name is Paul. I am a youth leader / activist, I suppose is a good explanation.
He's a white EFF person, the equivalent of a white EFF person.
Focusing on minority rights and equality in the workplace and stuff like that, which I think is very necessary. In terms of upbringing, I grew up in Johannesburg, a real city. When people tell me they come from the city of Pretoria, I'm like, everything
it's a town.
Everything is quite close to everything else. But yeah, and then I studied in Potch next to the Mooirivier, which is great. I think it's a river that weighs more than it counts, if that makes sense. And then I came to Pretoria at the beginning of last year and beginning of 2018 to do the job that I'm currently doing, and that's been great.
Yeah. And just for you as listener, Paul's not an EFF member. I'm quite far from it, just for clarity's sake. And Paul does really amazing work.
That could have been funny though. It's like, oh, so you're the one guy.
Those people, but I've never understood it. Those people that are white EFF members who are part of a party that literally actively hate white people. I really don't get it.
Yeah. Well, so what we're going to do today is we're going to discuss our favorite books about death and taxes and change. And we'll do it in that order, just simply to say what influenced the way that we think, and maybe as an introduction for the episodes that will come. And when this is the largest podcast in the world, then obviously.
Yeah, and for you as listener, the Death, Taxes and Change podcast, obviously we don't talk about just death, taxes and change specifically. It's a metaphor for speaking about life philosophy, in terms of death, your religion, your worldview. How do you see
your morality?
Yeah. How do you see the world around you? And then obviously taxes is what do you see politics as, and how do you see the role of government, and what is your political philosophy? And then lastly, change, I think, is to talk about the future and to talk about what we and our people that we interview think of the future and what we think of the future. And I think it's quite an important discussion to have in South Africa.
Yeah, and obviously what change we feel is important and is going to be important in the future. So let's get right into it. Daniël, in terms of books that influenced you and influenced the way that you're thinking, when we hit death, obviously morality, religion, worldview and so on, what was the book that stood out for you in your life thus far in terms of that field?
Well, I think we decided beforehand that we can't say the Bible. So, even though I think that has been an influential book in my life and I think in yours as well. For you listeners that don't know, both Paul and I are Christians, and quite proudly so. But a book that I would say it's second to the Bible, and it's a close second, is a book by C.S. Lewis called Mere Christianity. And it's a book that really influenced my life as well. When I was a student, we had an apologetics group at our church that was quite active. And after joining that apologetics group, we first read Lee Strobel's books, The Case for Christ, The Case for God, and The Case for Christianity, which are fantastic books. I would recommend those 3 books to any person. Lee Strobel writes a very easy to read book for most people to follow, and it's really an awesome introduction to apologetics. But after that, I went and I searched and I looked and I thought, what is a fantastic book to read in apologetics? And then I found Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, which is obviously quite an old book. It's not a modern apologetics book. It's not the same as Reasonable Faith by William Lane Craig. But it is an influential book, and I think it's a book that has influenced a lot of people, and it's a book that a lot of people reference themselves, even though they might not be Christians. Richard Dawkins famously has spoken about the book. He's tried to refute a bunch of the points made in the book.
I like that you said tried to.
Attempt. Well, at least that's how I feel and how I view it. But yeah, that's a book that really had a massive influence on my life in terms of my faith and in terms of logically arguing for faith. Because I think that's what mere Christianity really gets right, is it's not just the live by faith, not by sight type of Christianity. It's these are the logical reasons to believe in the existence of God and in Christianity on earth.
So I think essentially for me, and I think on the other points we'll have vastly different books, but for me it was exactly the same book, but for vastly different reasons. The book Mere Christianity for me was a great book. Firstly, looking at the way that it was created. So what C.S. Lewis had to do, and I believe that this was a direct order from the British government, is during World War II, he had to once a week have a program on BBC Radio and sort of motivate people. And he did that by the way that he motivated himself as well, and that was through religion. And then by having these weekly sessions, almost a bit like a 1940s podcast, he got to a point where this book was created, and it was logical, and he used simple English to make very complex issues very simple. One of the issues that stands out for me, and when I was a student, I really had a lot to do with student politics, and I had a lot of people calling me interesting names, and I think race was a very important thing. And my key argument against racism, for instance, comes directly out of Mere Christianity, when C.S. Lewis says, remember to treat people like they are immortal. Remember to treat people as if you're going to be spending the rest of eternity with them. That is one quote that for me has stood out. If I treat someone in such a way that I can never look them in the eye again, essentially I'm breaking that rule. So for me, that was a very influential book as well. As you say, obviously standing next to or secondary to the Bible. I think the Heidelberg Catechism is also a book that we could discuss, but that probably doesn't necessarily fall in the field that we're discussing right now, as it's not necessarily a book, it's more of a dialogue, I suppose.
Yeah, and I mean, there are plenty of amazing books that I think influence you, and each one incrementally changes your view or challenges your view, at least.
And shapes you.
Yeah. And completely, it absolutely shapes you. It's the same about reading Richard Dawkins' famous book. It's a challenging book to read, especially as a Christian, but I would recommend to any Christian that you're supposed to read that. You're supposed to go and challenge yourself. You're supposed to challenge your faith in that sense, and you're supposed to, because in the end it strengthens your faith and it strengthens your worldview, and I think it's super important to do that in the end.
So perhaps moving along, when we get to the segment we call taxes, what would you say was the book that influenced the way that you see the role of government, the way that you see your place in the government and your own participation and so forth, the most up to now?
Well, it's also interesting because I think political philosophy books are the books that I've read the most of. I really enjoy nonfiction, and I really enjoy political nonfiction. So there are so many books that I would recommend, but one that I've recently read and one that I think has shaped from when I read it and up until now has really shaped my worldview is not necessarily a book that's overtly about politics. It's a book by Nicholas Taleb called Skin in the Game, and it doesn't talk just about politics. It doesn't talk about taxes in that sense, like how we, refer to it in the metaphorical sense. What Skin in the Game says is it gives a way to look at the world and to explain certain things. And what Taleb argues is that things are successful and things work in our world, in our communities, in our civilizations when people have skin in the game. So, for an example, a really simple example, bureaucrats in a big bureaucracy in South Africa or wherever in the world, in any state department, don't have skin in the game because whatever they do, it doesn't really matter. It's of no consequence to them. But whenever they incentivize, whenever they have a financial incentive or any incentive, they take better decisions. And Taleb points to a bunch of places where...
So it's like giving a director some shares.
Yes, exactly. So Skin in the Game really shaped how I view the world, and it shaped... I think what it did is it just took off a lot of the rough edges that I might have had in my ideology and my worldview. by refining how I see things. And what I think it also did is it took me from being quite ideological in the sense that I just thought the state and the government sucks at everything, and that's just, full stop, that's where it goes. Where it might be that if there's skin in the game, certain things where the state's involved can work. We spoke earlier today, off air about vouchers. Vouchers they're not libertarian. I mean, let's be honest, they're not pragmatically libertarian. They are pragmatically libertarian, they're not ideologically libertarian. But I think vouchers are a wonderful way to try to incentivize services in South Africa. And you can imagine, rather than spending the massive budget that we have on basic education in South Africa and giving each child a voucher of 20,000 Rand each year and telling them, go to whichever school you'd like to go. And you have all these schools competing to get these vouchers. I mean, it would be amazing. You suddenly have competition, good, healthy competition.
And another interesting thing for me is, what if you said that the bonuses for ministers, for instance, would be dependent on their shares, and their shares are in state-owned enterprises? If Eskom fails, then they don't get a bonus this year. All of a sudden, that changes the game.
Exactly. So that's what Taleb argues in Skin in the Game. There are so many other political books that have shaped how I view the world. I think a lot of people have read Ayn Rand. A lot of people have read Friedrich Hayek. I had a friend who is involved in DA party politics, and we spent a weekend together at my house 2 years ago. And I remember he was super surprised when he heard I actually read Marx, and he was like, he's never really met a person who's honestly read Marx beside himself. So note to self, DA people have read Marx, guys. I think it might not be so surprising to you. But there are many books that have shaped how I view the world, but I think the one that recently stands out is this one. Another one that I really also enjoyed was Guns, Germs and Steel. I don't know if you've read it.
Nope.
It's also a wonderful book explaining why different civilizations in different parts of the world had different circumstances and developed differently. But then along with that, just after I read Guns, Germs and Steel, I read a book by Neil Ferguson called The West and the Rest, which I think really complemented Guns, Germs and Steel and gave another perspective on why the West got to where it was. The book argues about it points to 6 things that the West got right during the past 500 years. It says competition, modern medicine, It mentions specifically Protestant work ethic, and a bunch of other things, that why the West is separated from the rest of the world and why it really grew so exponentially. But then what's interesting is the book ends by Ferguson saying that the Asian countries at the moment, these Asian tigers, are adopting these 6 principles while the West have started eroding them, and where they started, tossing them by the wayside. And that's why we're seeing this emergence in economies in Asia at the moment.
Okay. So for me, I would say that, and I don't think it's an easy answer. The first answer would be, I've been really influenced in terms of philosophy by, for instance, Plato's defense of Socrates, and the parts of Plato's Republic that sort of shape your thinking. But I wouldn't say that's the book that influenced me most. In terms of understanding the world as it is now, I would say that Samuel Huntington's book, The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of World Order, is a great book. He wrote this book sort of in answer to Francis Fukuyama's The End of History. Now, both these books came out in the early to middle 90s, sort of as a way of predicting what will happen now that the wall has come down in Berlin, and now that the Soviet Union is no more. What Huntington does, which I appreciate, is essentially saying that due to language, due to religion, due to history, you have different civilizations. And the chances that they will essentially amalgamate are zero, and that you are likely to find clashes along the lines where these civilizations meet. Obviously, the book was met with, I think, a lot of resistance, because it doesn't fit this leftist, liberal, or far left sort of worldview that we'll all at the end of the day hold hands, irrelevant of culture, irrelevant of religion. But what he said was proven true. But yet the book that influenced me most, being purely honest, is, okay, I was at university in the Obama era, completely only in my final year Trump was president, but the US president has a large impact on the way that South Africans see the world. So I was a student during this time where sort of a victim mentality became really popular. Fees Must Fall became a thing, and everyone was competing to be the biggest victim. I'll refer to Jordan Peterson a bit later again, but he says in the second chapter of his book, 12 Rules for Life, he says that pain matters more than matter matters. And that's a quote that really hit me, because all of a sudden everyone was talking about their pain, their victimhood, and so on. And a book that really answered a lot of these questions for me was Letters to a Young Conservative by Dinesh D'Souza. So what he does is in 3 or 4 page letters, he sort of answers difficult issues from a more conservative worldview. All of a sudden you're confronted with residence culture that doesn't allow you to open a meeting with scripture or prayer, or you have to leave certain traditions behind because it's deemed as intolerable, even though it is 100 years old and even though it harms no one. So in answering or sort of getting my own mind around these difficult left-leaning victim mentality problems, I think D'Souza gave some answers. Obviously, I don't agree with everything that he says, and obviously I think he's quite radical on some things, and on other things maybe not radical enough. But that was a book that really shaped it for me.
There's a book by a writer, US writer, American writer, Jonathan Haidt, which is called The Coddling of the American Mind, which is exactly about this point that you just made, Paul, about how victimhood mentality has really taken hold of US culture. And I think for us as South Africans and most people in the world, we have to acknowledge that USA culture really has a massive influence on how we see things. And we've seen that victimhood mentality hitting our shores, unfortunately, as well. I haven't read the book yet. I just know that a lot of people talk really highly about it, and I'm really super keen to read it. And I think it would, fit into this point you just made. But moving on to the last books that influenced our lives and influence how we think regarding the future and regarding change. What is a book that has stood out in your life?
So, once again, there are 2 books that stand out for me. The one is a very recent book, and that is 12 Rules for Life by Jordan Peterson. So what he does good is that he sort of reaffirms values that have become taboo. The idea that you should stand up straight, the idea that you should take control of the basic things in your life, the idea that you should treat those weaker than you with respect, and sort of help them the way that you should treat. So basic principles that have been reaffirmed. I think going into the future, we should be very wary of just allowing all of our values to just run away with the water. So that's a book that I appreciated. Yet I would say that the book that influences my view of the future the most is a book by the name of Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. So he wrote this book in the months after he came out of the concentration camps in Austria. He was a Jew who was captured during World War II, and he spent his time as a doctor helping other Jews, often in very, very bad circumstances. And the argument of the book essentially can be summarized in one sentence, and that is that for a person with a good why, a person with a good why can bear almost any how. And that's a literal quote out of the book, but it also summarizes the book quite nicely. And the idea that he has is that as long as we keep in mind that there's a good future waiting, that this that we are doing, even though it might be painful right now, will lead to something better. And we keep holding on to that something better. Whether in the evenings you sit in traffic and that sucks, but you know that you're going home and it's nice to be home, so therefore you bear the traffic. For the same, you work hard now to save money, to retire, whatever, so you work towards a future. I'm not saying we should delay the future, we should obviously enjoy what we're doing now. But I think that going forward, the world should remember that if we keep working hard, if we keep not destroying each other, if we keep away from massive world wars, even though that might be a struggle sometimes, essentially we'll get to a place that is better. And that would be the why. Why do we do these things? And then we get to and then we can bear the how.
The how. I think Brené Brown also wrote not exactly this point, but also said that you need to find your why in life. And if you find your why in life, then the rest really does fall into place.
Yes, Simon Sinek also wrote a book in 2011 with the name Start With Why.
Yes.
This whole idea of finding meaning in the new millennium and so on. Yeah.
But just on the 12 Rules for Life, I've also read Peterson's book, and it is a wonderful book to read. But what really struck me after reading it is that it's necessary to have a worldwide best-selling book telling you to do these really basic things like make up your bed and stand up straight and, all these normal things. And what's even more weird about it is, despite the fact that it's so obvious, or for a lot of people it's so obvious, it really has such a massive impact. If you just listen to Peterson's podcast, where he talks about his book. He says he's really in awe about the feedback that he's getting. He's getting feedback from normal people just saying that this book, these 12 rules for life, these simple rules, have changed their lives. And then they go up to him and they say, thank you. And it's just crazy for me to think that we live in a time where standing up straight and making up your bed are considered so massive and so life-changing.
Yeah, so I think what happened was we had this very, very strict generation after World War II, and they sort of raised their kids with all these rules and corporate punishment, not corporate punishment.
Corporate punishment, evil
Corporal
capitalists.
punishment. And then what happened was their children overreacted and raised their children without any rules. And many of our generation Y, Generation Z, the millennials and the kids going to school right now were raised without any values. Their parents are like, whatever, just do what you want. We'll be buddies. We won't be parent and child. And children need that anchor. They need rules. They need structures. And even though that might be unpopular right now, people will thank, it might be unpopular in certain circles. People will thank Jordan Peterson in the future for reaffirming the fact that certain basic rules need to be in place.
So just for you listeners who have not read Peterson's book, I think it's just to briefly mention the 12 rules. And this is like Blinkers, the reading app. We give you the whole book in a short summary. Paul, you please just tell me if I got it wrong, but the 12 rules are: firstly, stand up straight with your shoulders straight, which is a basic thing. Secondly, treat others like someone you are responsible for helping, which you mentioned already. Befriend people who want the best for you, which I think is also so super important. And usually these people who want the best for you are your family members. Then, fourthly, it was, I think, compare yourself to who you were yesterday, not the person you are today, which I also think is great advice, because then you always see success. And if you try to be a better person than you were yesterday, you'll always see progress, which also makes so much sense to me. Then on the fifth point, it was set your house in order before you criticize the world, which also to a certain extent makes a lot of sense. Just, I think it happens often. You just point fingers because it's easier than sorting out your own.
Yeah, sort of taking control of the small things. And I think that's a theme that goes through the book.
And then it's something about your children, about don't let your children do anything that makes you dislike them. So don't let them, it's again like the thing where you talk about the parent-child relationship. You have to, you guide them through life. Then on the seventh point, it was do meaningful things. I remember one of the other ones was tell the truth, or at least don't lie, which whatever that means. I remember Peterson had a whole argument about that exactly in that nuanced difference.
Yeah, and that was quite good, yes.
Yeah. Then also that assume the person you are listening knows something you don't, which I think is super important. Never ever think you're the smartest person in the room. You can always learn something from people. Be precise in your speech. Don't bother children while they're skateboarding. I remember that one quite vividly and good. And then the last one was you have to pet pets whenever you see them or encounter some of them on the street.
So I think obviously every rule is explained in vast detail, but every one of them adds value in a very specific way. For instance, Rule 7, pursue what is meaningful. This whole idea that there is something meaningful and you can pursue it. We've come in this time of post-truth, so whatever you think, you can just do that. But some things are meaningful and they are worthwhile. And therefore they should be pursued. All of these rules are valuable, and I think it's a book worth considering, even though it is not my number one book in this category.
Yeah. From my side, a book that has, it's not about the future and it's not written in the future. In fact, it's written quite a few years ago, is a book by Aldous Huxley called Brave New World. I don't know if a lot of people have read the book, but it's a fantastic book. I know a lot of people read Orwell's 1984, which is similar. It's both talk about a dystopian future and kind of warn against what might happen. But Brave New World, I think, is quite an underrated book. Both of the books are fantastic, but Brave New World I read it when I was super young, and it did really change how I see the world and how I see the future. But then there are obviously, I think most books, the fact that they change how you think, it necessarily then changes how you see the future and what you think of the future. So I think reading, just broadly speaking, books change how you view the future and how you view change.
And we have this idea that you can practice and become more fit. You can eat better and then be more healthy. but your intelligence, that's sort of, you're born with that. And that might be true on some biological level. I didn't study any of those things, but I think you can become smarter. By knowing more things, you can have more intelligent conversations. You can have more points to lock onto with people. And that essentially makes you a smarter person. So my recommendation would just be keep reading.
Okay, Paul, and just to end off and wrap up this episode, what are you reading currently?
Reading a book by Mark Manson. The name is The Subtle Art of Not Giving a F, which just goes about prioritizing and really not caring too much about things that really aren't important. And you reading anything particular right now?
Yeah, I'm actually reading a book that a podcast recommended. It's a book called National Populism: The Revolt Against Liberal Democracy. It's by Roger Eatwell and Matthew Goodwin. It's really a wonderful book set in modern times, talks about the rise of populism in Europe and the United States, and it's quite a fascinating read, I must say.
Wonderful. I'll look out for it. So yeah, thank you for you as a listener for listening to the Death, Taxes and Change podcast. Daniel, where can people find the Death, Taxes and Change podcast?
Well, the Death, Taxes and Change podcast is obviously available on all good podcasting apps, Castbox, Pocket Casts, iTunes, Apple Podcasts, wherever. And then also on YouTube. You can view it on the Podmedia YouTube channel. And then, that's where we're at. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. And yeah, you can engage with us there. And then both Paul and I are obviously quite active on social media. So please give us a follow and put this conversation forth. Tell us which books have influenced your life during the, how long ever you have lived.
So this conversation, as well as the Death, Taxes and Change podcast as a whole, is proudly brought to you by Podmedia.